And we're here with the junior high students of Holy Spirit School, and we're going to talk a little bit about priesthood. Now, I'm going to start with a question though. How many of you have thought about what you'd like to be when you're growing? Okay, so many of you have thought about that. At this point in your life, what would you say you might like to be? Somebody just give me an example. Yep. What? A YouTuber. A YouTuber. Okay. Very good. Right there. Yep. A neurosurgeon. OBGYN. We got two doctors back there.
An athletic coach.
An athletic coach of any particular sport.
Maybe volleyball.
Maybe volleyball. Okay. I'll pick one more. Right there. A nurse. Okay. Hands down. So you're thinking about what you might like to be, and what if there was a particular program that you could enter into to study that particular field? Do you think you know well enough that you would enter that program? In other words, let's say coming out of 8th grade, let's say there was a special program for nursing. Not that you had to stay in it, but it would kind of start directing you towards nursing. Would you enter that program? What do you think, Ava? Probably. Okay. Well, when I was young, 8th grade, there was that kind of program available for becoming a priest. There was a seminary for high school students. And if you thought you might want to be a priest, but you were not sure, then you would go into that particular program. And so at the age of 14, I left home. And I went to a seminary called St. Mary's High School, which was about 2 hours from my parents' house, where I grew up. And I studied my 4 years of high school there. And I was with other students who were thinking about being a priest. Now, take a guess how big my high school class was when we started freshmen. And think small. Don't think big. Logan?
64.
64. Think smaller. Think smaller. It was 28 students in my freshman class as high school. And we were from all across the country. I had classmates from Indiana, obviously, from Kentucky, but I also had classmates from Louisiana, Alabama, and up in New Jersey. Now, of the 28 who started as 14-year-olds, as freshmen in high school, there was 4 years of high school, 4 years of college, and 4 years of graduate school. So that's how many years it was to be a priest. So 4 years of undergrad and 4 years of graduate school. Take a guess how many of us were ordained of that 28. Think small.
8.
Pretty close. 5. So there were 5 of us ordained out of 28. So most of the people decided to be something else. But I was one of those 5 that throughout those years of seminary preparation, I kind of stayed with the notion that I wanted to be a priest. And so I started in the seminary when I was 14, and I was ordained when I was 26. Actually, one month shy of my 26th birthday with it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the questions you gave, but also the journey to priesthood. Now, I've got an album here, and this album was put together for me for my 25th anniversary, which has been a number of years ago. And it's from different parts of my life. But I want to just show you the young Father Paul. Now, don't laugh too much there, okay? So here I am. I'm like a 7th grader there. And here I'm in high school seminary. I think I'm a sophomore there. I think I'm in college here. I'm like a junior in college here. And I think this one was my senior class picture for high school. I'm going to kind of start walking through some of the questions that you have here. Now, one question was, how many years does it take to be a priest? What did I just tell you?
16.
4 college and 4 graduate school. So it's 8 years of school after high school. It takes 8 years of school. It's very similar to being a doctor. Okay? Now, if you go to college and get a degree in another field. Like let's say you go to Purdue and get a degree in engineering. Father Chris did this. Father Chris went to IUPUI and got a degree in engineering. Then he worked for 12 years. Then he went to the seminary. Now in that case, it took him 6 more years because he had to do some undergraduate work before he could go into the graduate school. So actually, if you go through a seminary in college and graduate school, it takes you 8. But it could take longer if you go to another college. Now, one person asked, what's your favorite part of the Mass? Well, you know, that depends upon which Mass I'm having. If it's the school Mass, probably what I enjoy the most is the homily, because I'm really curious about what answers I'm going to get from the students out there. And of course, you know, the younger the kids, the crazier the answer sometimes. So if a kindergartner holds up their hand when I ask a question in Mass, I love to call upon them, because they probably don't even know what the question is. And it's always interesting to see. But I enjoy the dialogue that goes on there. Other times it's giving communion. When people come up to communion, and you know, lots of times I know the people coming up to communion, and when they're adults, sometimes I know what they're going through. So maybe someone just lost their husband, or maybe I know someone is sick in the family, or they're struggling. So giving them communion means something special, because I know how much they need Christ. I know how much they're searching. Sometimes it's the consecration. That's where I bless the bread and the wine, and I elevate it, because that's the most sacred time in the Mass. That's when Christ really becomes a part of us through the bread and wine that's in front of us. So it depends a little bit on the Mass. Now someone asked, what's the worst thing you have to do as a priest? This was probably somebody whose glass is half empty. I would say the most difficult thing is dealing with people who have heavy tragedies in their life. So if something very, very sad happens in someone's life, it's not easy. It's difficult to be with them, and yet that's sometimes when people need you the most. So if someone's parent dies, or if someone is involved in a serious accident, sometimes going to the hospital to visit is both good and bad as far as the experience. How do you think? It's pretty obvious how it can be bad, because you're going into a situation that is very difficult and maybe someone's dying. How do you think it's good, though? Going to the hospital when someone is in serious condition, how do you think that could be good?
It could be good because you know that person, and they could feel happier and feel good.
So you know the person, and maybe they would feel good because you're there with them. Yeah. Well, you get to see them for the last time. There's some truth in that. That's true. That's true. What else would you say?
You could help them.
Yeah. Because when they're in the hospital at that situation, they need help so much. And sometimes when something bad has happened, you just need to be reminded that God is with you. And I think when I come into a room and I pray with people, and maybe their loved one is laying in the bed, and maybe their loved one is close to death, and I pray with them and I pray over that person, it reminds them that God is with them in that. And sometimes they just need to know that God is there. And then I can help prepare their loved one to die. So I think sometimes I feel really good when I've gone to the hospital. Not because it's fun. You know, sometimes I get called out in the middle of the night. You know, 2 o'clock in the morning, the phone rings and says, Father, my dad's in the emergency room at Community East. He just had a massive heart attack. Can you come? So I put my clothes on and I go to the hospital. Now, I'm not looking forward to that, but I will tell you, almost every time I leave the hospital, I'm very glad that I was a priest. I'm very glad that I could do that, because I know someone needed help and I was able to help them. And that makes all the difference in the world. So sometimes the good and the bad are mingled together. You understand what I'm saying? Sometimes it's really difficult, but yet it's one of the best parts, of being a priest. Now someone asked, are you ever lonely? Well, the answer is yes. But I'd like to ask you, are you ever lonely? Yes. I bet you are. I bet sometimes you just feel lonely. Like you don't know if you have a good friend. Or even if you have a good friend, you're not with them. And I bet you any money, if I ask the married teachers that are here, there are times that they're lonely. Even if you have a wonderful marriage, you can still have times that you're lonely. Because sometimes nobody can fill that spot inside of you except who? God. Another person can't. You can have the best marriage in the world, but sometimes you're going to be lonely. So am I lonely at times? Yes. There are times that I wish I had somebody with me, or I wish I had someone around me, and sometimes that can ache some. There's lots of times I'm really glad to go home and be by myself because I've been with people all day long. And so some of you who are introverts, sometimes you like being by yourself? Yes. Okay, I'm like that too. Now one person asked, have you ever messed up at Mass? And the answer is yes. Do you want to hear about it? Yes. I kind of thought you did. Well, one time I was at the altar and we had just poured the wine into the chalice. And back then, this is a number of years ago, I used to put the book in front of the chalice. So the priest is standing here, the bread's here, the chalice is here, and I would put the book in front and I'd read over top the chalice, okay? Well, one time I reached across and I flipped the page of the book and I brought my finger back and I caught the top of the chalice. And I pitched a full chalice down the front of my vestments. Okay. Now, it was a school mass. It was a school, not here, another place. It was a school mass. Well, I had dark green vestments on, okay? And I turned the chalice up right away. And I looked over to the server and I said, "Get me more wine." And he went and found more wine, brought it out, I poured it in there, and I went on. I don't think most of the kids even knew it. I don't think they saw me tip it, but I took that whole, and you know the cup I use at Mass? You know that silver one? It's got a pretty big cup with it, with a little base. It'll tip. It'll tip. So that was one time I messed up. Another time, I forgot the consecration. Now that's where you bless the bread and the wine. It's the most important time of the Mass. And I forgot it. And so it's a long story how I did it, but I forgot it. And so we get to the sign of peace. And I go up to the first person to give the sign of peace. And they said, "Father, you forgot to bless the bread and wine." And I'm kind of going, "What? What?" Then I go to the second person. They say, "Father, you forgot the consecration." I had forgotten the whole thing. I had to go back and redo the whole thing. Now, there's other littler things that I've done, and some of the servers probably have noticed little things that I've done. But sure, you can make mistakes at Mass or any other time. Just like the servers can make mistakes sometimes, right? You know, you servers, when I say, "Let us pray," and I stand up and I look over to the server and he's in la-la land, and I'll go, Stuart, the book. Not that Stuart's ever done that. Okay, did you ever have a girlfriend? Okay, that was one question. I never had a steady girlfriend. I did date some when I was growing up, but I never had a steady girlfriend. But let me say, throughout my years of being a priest, I've had many friends, some of whom are guys and some are girls. So I think as a priest, you have many friends in your life, okay? You have many friends, and I continue to have many friends, some of whom are women and some are men. So it's not like, you can't talk to a woman type of thing. As a priest, you take a promise of what's called celibacy. Celibacy is that you will not marry, okay? And obviously you have to stay what's called chaste, okay, that you don't have a physical relationship with a woman, but you can have friendships. And I think it's important to realize for all of you all that you can have really good friendships with someone from the opposite sex, and it doesn't have to be physical. You can have great friends. Great friends. Matter of fact, I've talked to people when they do marriage prep. When I do marriage prep with them, preparing couples for marriage, and sometimes I'll have a couple come in and they'll say, "Father, we were best friends for 10 years before we ever started to date." You know, she would say, he would come home from a date and he'd call me and tell me how it went. Okay? Because they were such good friends. And later, they decided to let that friendship become more. But just remember, you can have good friends, and you should have good friends without that being a physical relationship. Why can't women be priests? Now that's a great question. And I think there's various ways of answering that, but I'm going to approach it from a particular way that talks about the role of the priest and the role of the church. Now, if you go to the Bible, it talks about Jesus as the bridegroom. The bridegroom. And the church, the people of God, is the bride. Okay? So, when the priest is celebrating Mass, or in a position of any of the sacraments, he is trying to take the place of Christ in that setting. You know? So that's why when I'm at Mass up here, when I consecrate the bread and wine, I say, "This is my body, this is my blood." Well, it's not Father Paul's body, it's not Father Paul's blood. I'm taking the place of Christ in that moment. So I take the place of Christ, the bridegroom. The people, all of you, are the bride. The church is the bride. And so you have the bridegroom and the bride. And together they make a union. Okay? That's a theology of priesthood in the community. Well, bridegrooms are usually men. And so the person who takes the place of Christ in that bridegroom and bride exchange is a man. The church is always referred to in the feminine. So if you ever hear someone talk about the church, you will hear the female pronoun. The church. She, if you read church documents, it talks about the church, she, ba, 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 ba. Because the church is the bride of Christ. So why are priests men? Because they're in the role of the bridegroom, in the relationship between the bride, and the bride is all of you. Now there's other reasons that play into that. But that would certainly be one of the reasons why the priest stands as the bridegroom in relationship to the bride, the church.